We want to turn to our first guest and our first story here, and that is the murder by Minnesota State Troopers of Ricky Cobb II. And we are very honored to be joined here on the show once again by Michelle Gross, who's the president of Communities Against Police Brutality there in the Twin Cities area. Michelle, as always, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me today. Hopefully you folks can hear me okay.
Yes, we can definitely hear you, and we are honored to have you. And maybe just to start, because this has gotten some press, but maybe not that much. For those who haven't heard, what took place, or what do we know at least, vis-a-vis these state troopers having killed Mr. Cobb?
Well, it looks like the state troopers pulled Mr. Cobb over ostensibly for an equipment violation. They claimed that his taillights were out. It looks like they were lying about that, basically. But in essence, they pulled him over, and then they kind of manufactured a reason to try to force him out of the vehicle. And he was talking to a state trooper on the driver's side. And the state trooper was saying, you need to get out of your vehicle, and, was kind of talking to him when a different state trooper came up on the passenger side, approached him right away with his gun drawn, put the gun right in his face, essentially. And we should be really clear that Mr. Cobb was never armed. He presented no threats of any kind, life-threatening or any otherwise, to either of the state troopers. And suddenly that state trooper on the passenger side opened fire on Mr. Cobb and shot him. And not only did he kill Mr. Cobb, but he also shot in the direction of his partner state troopers. They were in the line of fire as well. So it was really, sometimes you get these things where they can try to say it's justified, or they can, sort of use different reasons. This one was so blatantly not justified that people are really upset, and they should be. It's really an appalling situation. The police later tried to claim that he was not wanted on a warrant or any such thing, but that they had wanted to talk to him about some possible kind of domestic situation or something. But the reality is that those are not the basis for pulling somebody over, and there was no legal basis even to ask him to step out of the vehicle.
Yeah, it's really horrific. And also, of course, this took place in the same, city where George Floyd was killed by police. So I'm just curious, what does this mean about any changes, if there have been any, and whether they matter in a place like Minneapolis, if this is continuing to take place where police, killed another unarmed person, seemingly without any cause. And once again, another family has lost a father, a husband, a loved one.
Exactly. And, that's the thing. We are in a pitched battle here to try to make the police behave in a constitutional manner. It's notable that this is the state troopers. So that's the state police agency that did this. And they have a very nasty history of engaging in like high-speed chases that they don't call off. And in fact, they were involved in a high-speed chase just a few weeks prior that killed 5 people. And so, that kind of thing. And so they're very hard to hold accountable. And worst of all, our police department, I should say rather, our state relies on the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, which is like sort of the state's version of the FBI, to investigate these cases. And the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, or what we call the BCA, is actually part of the same state agency that the state troopers are a part of. So essentially, you've got an agency investigating itself. So we're not expecting to have a substantial or realistic or neutral type of investigation. We know that the BCA does a really poor job of investigating police cases anyway. The investigations are designed to clear the cops, and now we've got them investigating yet another part of their same agency. So we're not looking for any kind of a outcome from those people whatsoever, that kind of thing. But you're right, it's a real pitched battle to get justice. The day that Ricky Cobb was killed is the same day that we won a lawsuit for the mother of Cordell Handy, who was murdered by the St. Paul police. And we won her an $11.5 million judgment, the largest by far that St. Paul has ever paid out, the previous largest judgment being $2 million. So, there's all of these efforts in the courts to try to hold these cops accountable, and yet they don't get criminal charges. It's questionable whether these cops that murdered, or this particular cop that murdered Ricky Cobb, is going to ever see justice. So it's just an ongoing effort here to fight the cover-ups and to bring real change.
It's such an important point, and I'm also, even go back to what you were saying to my first question. I think it's so important to understand some of these details, that he was not armed, that these other people. I mean, you hate to even have to say this, but I feel like some of why this is such an uphill battle is there's so much disinformation put out in all these circumstances. I mean, before I actually saw the circumstances of Mr. Cobb's death, I saw the tweet thread from Representative Dean Phillips, which is, about police violence in general, but he talks about the importance of understanding the fear of an officer approaching a car with a felon who may be armed. So I thought, when I started looking up the case, I said, I thought that was the details, actually.
Right.
And then when they weren't, I was like, oh, wow, that's shocking. But, he's an important person, well-known representative. I actually met him in Minneapolis once at a press conference of Families of Police Brutality right after George Floyd was killed, in which he said, I want to do better. And it just seems like these kind of comments are exactly the type of thing that create problems, when it's sort of portraying the idea that when police kill someone, it's like one of these close-run situations. Like, it's unfortunate, but the person was also maybe a bad person.
Right. That's the framing they always do, because they need some way to cover for these police. But I think you're exactly right that, we've got an elected official, who's supposed to be responsible to the community, over here mouthing this, the fear of the police type stuff. Okay, if you're so damn fearful, excuse my language, but if you're so fearful of these kinds of encounters, don't pull these people over for nonsense. This was a pretextual stop. They thought, here's a guy driving, let's pull him over, let's see if we can find something. It was a pretextual stop with no good reasons. And if you're so fearful of it, stop doing those pretextual stops. In Minneapolis, we've got 2 consent decrees going on, one with the Minnesota Department of Human Rights and the other with the Department of Justice. That one hasn't been finalized, but we've got these, consent decrees, and one of them, the state consent decree actually prohibits police from having from doing pretextual stops. This needs to happen throughout the whole state. We need to stop this practice.
Another element of this that's interesting is that there was dash cam footage that was released that, of course, did show that the police didn't have any reason to shoot this person. And the reason I raise that is because I remember maybe like a decade ago, or even less, oftentimes the idea of the dash cam was used to say, oh, yes, like this is what's going to help, keep police in line. They're going to be less likely to shoot and kill people without provocation and less likely to abuse people. But time after time, it seems like in a lot of these instances where police are shooting and killing unharmed people around the country, there is dash cam footage that actually confirms what the families of the victims, or the victims themselves, if they survive, are saying happened. So I'm just curious what you have to say about, the idea of the dash cam being able to be a tool in reforming police behavior in America.
Well, dash cams and body-worn cams are some good evidence that we can acquire. I know that there's efforts in some states to actually prohibit people from having access to that information. We luckily are in a state where that kind of information is available, and we have sued multiple times to get access to it. In this particular case, they released the footage, but they didn't release all the footage. They released selected portions of the footage. And what we looked at when we examined the footage in detail is that they actually cut out 8 frames of the footage that showed some of the more important information. And particularly when you listen to and look at the video, what you'll notice is you never hear the gunshots, because they eliminated that footage. And so, the information is valuable to the community, but only to the extent that we can access it. And to the extent that the police control access to that information, that's what's harmful to the community. If you think what you did was so right, release it all. Just release all of it and make it all available to all of us, and let us be the judges. But, they want to carefully curate their stories. You'll recall that the Minneapolis police actually stood on the sidewalk outside of City Hall and said that George Floyd died from a medical emergency. While in the meantime, all of us are looking at the community footage that showed the real story. So we see this all the time in policing, where there's a carefully crafted and carefully narrated version that's put out to try to give the police officers, some chance to cover for what they've done. And as long as they control the data, it's always going to be that way.
Well, I'm glad you raised that issue because, and especially this being a state police case, I think maybe raises this. I mean, is there something that the Minnesota state legislature needs to do? I mean, I certainly, know that they're getting a lot of credit for doing a lot of progressive things in their last session. Are there things they can do to address some of these issues more substantively?
Absolutely. And I smiled to myself when you said that because, we've got 8 bills that we've had at the legislature for the last 4 years that they haven't barely touched. They did finally pass last year the one of my bills, which was the ban on no-knock warrants, although it's not a total ban, it's a substantial ban. So that's been a real battle for the last 4 years. But there are other things we need them to do. Particularly, we want to create an independent investigatory body that will make decisions about prosecutions, and actually do the investigations. We've got to take this out of the realm of the cops investigating the cops. This has to get away from that. We also want to create a mechanism where people have pretty much instantaneous access to all of the footage, unedited, at least the families have access to that footage within 24 hours. And that's a bill that we've had at the legislature for 4 years. And really, finally, the most important thing is to end qualified immunity. Qualified immunity is what protects cops who, pretend like they somehow didn't know that it was wrong to murder somebody. And we, unfortunately, people who should get justice don't get it because of qualified immunity. So we've got to end qualified immunity, both at the state level and at the federal level. And so those are all things that we're working on to try to get to happen.
So in this particular case, what happens next? You mentioned the police investigating themselves. Then what happens? I you can't predict exactly how it's going to go down, but I assume there is a typical way things tend to move. And then let's say the police investigate themselves and they clear themselves. Then what are the options in terms of being able to get justice for this family?
Sure. So here's the situation. We have a new progressive, county attorney who would be the one making the prosecutory decisions. She's done this whole song and dance number, though, despite the fact that she's, supposedly better than what we had before. She's done a whole song and dance number about, we have to wait for the BCA to finish their investigation, even though we've raised that these people are not neutral and they're investigating themselves. It's completely inappropriate. But she's towing the party line, basically. And then the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension will take 6 or 9 months to, do a quasi investigation that's got a certain design. And then they'll come back. And if it's anything like that's always happened before, there will be no charges. Now, contrast this with, let's say that there is a community violence situation that happens where, somebody kills somebody else and there's video footage of it. They wouldn't hesitate to bring charges. Why are we acting like this is some kind of a special situation because it's cops? If somebody kills somebody and they weren't supposed to, let's bring some charges. And you know what? They'll get their day in court. I'm not saying let's not have a day in court. We all say that they should have the day in court, but let's actually have that day in court, not just wait around for some phony investigation. And, 9 months or a year after everybody's calmed down, then they'll come out with a little quiet press release and say, well, we didn't think we could prove the case against them and blah, 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 blah. And that'll be the typical thing that'll happen in this case as well, which is frankly sickening, and it shouldn't be allowed to happen.
Mm-hmm. Michelle, before we let you go, where can people find Communities Against Police Brutality if they want to support your work?
Sure. Communities United Against Police Brutality is on the internet. We've got www.cuapb.org. We are on Facebook, all over the place on Facebook, on social media. People just need to reach out to support our work and also to learn more about police brutality. Our website is packed with information about how people can end police brutality. Lots and lots of ideas and lots of ways to get involved.
Mm-hmm. Michelle Gross, president of Communities United Against Police Brutality, thank you so much for giving us some of your time here in the Freedom Side.
Great. Thank you for having me today.
Mm-hmm.